So we can just start with opening it up, I guess. Did anyone have anything that stood out to them that they think was really interesting about our roles as educators, who will, have to, in one way or another, be using AI in our jobs?
Just as full disclosure, I haven't actually listened to the podcast, got too busy, but I'm here for the ride as usual, and I'll have plenty to opine about. Yes, I'm terrified of AI. There you go.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think I think Steve and I are in the same camp. Like you probably know that I also am a little worried about where that's going, but the podcast, so maybe I'll just ask you a question, Alex, to get us started. The the guest of the podcast, it sounded like you said you've been working in AI for decades, which struck me as interesting, but then went on to, on my read, conflate algorithmic technology with artificial intelligence. And um, the epistemic problem always stands out to me. Like we keep using this phrase AI, and the Princess Bride line comes back to me. I don't think that term means what you think it means. Um,
Uh-huh.
so I wonder what you thought. Like in education, is this person using the term AI like most educators do, or is there a conflation we can tease out?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point that I had not thought about. And full disclosure, it's not that my understanding of AI is very sophisticated here. So it will include my understanding of AI, at least includes anything from, algorithms that are used by search engines, social media, etc., to any form of like, generative AI, like Chat GPT, things of that sort, which are a bit more advanced. So a lot of things, I guess, can fall under this umbrella. And they all include, these very specific kinds of AI that are not, general artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence designed to do very specific tasks. So in that sense, I guess, um, I might equate it with algorithms, though I do not have a full understanding of what algorithms actually do either. Um, but it seems that, at least to the extent that I think you're talking about how this person was discussing about AI and how, AI basically performing some functions that they do not it does not really understand how it's performing. It's just designed to do these certain things. And from there on, how do we use it as a tool that could never ultimately replace us? Whereas it seems that you, Jonathan, have a more, and probably Steve from that description, have a more pessimistic take on what AI can and cannot do and whether we coexist.
Yeah, I'll start and then Steve can weigh in. But yeah, yeah, maybe I do have a pessimistic. I don't know if it's pessimistic. I just think it's I want to be a little more practical, I think, because there's a sense in which when we use the term AI, for a lot of people, I think it conflates, Alex, as you distinguish, like artificial general intelligence, the stuff of science fiction, and like Asimov and iRobot and all of these sort of humanoid replacement things, with all the technologies that have been around for a really, really long time, right? This podcast person was making the case that there's an equivalency or a trajectory building between like the algorithms that drive our search engines that have been around for a couple of decades and generative AI, and that there's really not a substantial difference in kind, right? That it's like a scaling up. And that's where you got into like the old wine and new bottles metaphor that you
Hmm.
sort of leaned into. So I just want to be, I always want to be a little more conceptually careful because those epistemic constraints inform then the ethics work that we do, right? I don't think we can pass the same ethics judgment on generative AI as we can on whatever Yahoo search engine or something.
Hmm. Hmm. Though there are a lot of problems that people have pointed out in terms of the even the simplest, algorithmic version of AI, and how it curates users' experience in ways that raises important ethical issues. And I'm thinking, I was reading recently for some work I've been doing again, the Algorithms of Oppression book, and how, like, you don't really need Chat GPT to have these problems manifest, though perhaps Chat GPT makes it even less transparent about, how these problems actually work, because you're not really understanding what it's doing. Whereas Google, you Google something, you see the order of the results and wonder, why did it give me these results and not other results? Whereas Chat GPT, like I thought the example of Chat GPT as an advanced search engine, right? It synthesizes all this information. I think there's certainly something more than scaling up, right? That really complicates the process of searching, so that you don't really understand what the search engine, if we could call Chat GPT that, is doing to give you the information.
I think there often is a lot of conflation between different technologies lumped under AI, and that's common with any of these little conversations that are happening out in the public sphere. A lot of the maybe oversimplification is driven just by the communication tool. Whether it's an opinion piece, or whether it's a whole book, or whether it's just people conversing on social media. So it's challenging, and I think having discussions like this and thinking about the ethics, we have responsibility maybe to define what we're talking about, right? So we're clear, but also freedom and opportunity to talk about AI writ large, because I do think looking at some of maybe of the older forms of AI could inform, how we think about the ethics of newer forms that are emerging, like generative AI and large language models. And to as one example, I would say some of the same problems that we have with more traditional Google search are really implicit in generative models. We do see the list that comes up when you Google search, but we really don't know 100% what's happening behind the algorithms, and that's one of our concerns. It throws up advertisements, and you can pay to have your stuff populate in the search higher than lower. So it's not just this altruistic tool to provide information. It's there to make money, right? Which is not in and of itself a bad thing, but it makes the point that you don't have 100% knowledge of how it works. We've had that conversation. We've recognized the challenges. We've seen the societal impacts. And here we are having similar conversations, maybe about something that scales and has even bigger impact, but we didn't solve those past problems. So I'm not really sure I feel that we're very well equipped to solve the newer problems. And that's where maybe some of my pessimism comes in. Yes, I have some concerns about job replacement, and things like that. But certainly I have lots of concerns about knowledge and information, and veracity of information, and how something's really real and not just created by a large language model and then propagated, and it's just the result of some hallucination or something that could derail democracy by in making claims that are not substantiated in facts. I certainly have concerns about things like that, but overall my bigger concern is we still as a society haven't really learned to deal with some of these with the emergence of disruptive technologies, and here we are again. And more than anything, it points to fundamental weaknesses that we have with education. When we say that not everyone knows what the AI is about, well, that's because it's not well understood. We don't maybe have good enough education systems. We don't have the time and the bandwidth to focus and follow all of these things. They're moving very quickly, and we may not even have, as a society and as individuals, equipment to think about these ethical issues. If we don't understand the technology, how do we then think about the ethics and the societal impacts and understand things like frameworks that Dr. Beaver can teach us all? So I think it's very, very complicated, and we're ill-equipped.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ian, do you have any thoughts?
Oh yeah, so I completely agree with what Dr. Kubler just said. The the one example that the podcast brought up about using generative AI as a form of reckoning versus I think they called it like social or practical wisdom. And then for reckoning, they brought up an example of how someone in Iowa would be looking at climate change predictions and for California, and it didn't make sense to them, so they wanted to have some sort of local knowledge integrated. And I think that's great. Modeling does that already. I don't understand how that was actually a really relevant example. Um, but what I took away from it more was users are going to use this and get some sort of extrapolation from the generative AI based on their local situation, but that doesn't necessarily have its uncertainty quantified. Whereas if you look at like any other sort of climate model, just going with that example again, there's usually that cone, right? For hurricanes, for anything, there's that cone of uncertainty. But if you have citizens going and just trying to learn about how climate change is going to impact their homes in Iowa, they're going to probably get like a direct readout answer, and they're going to think that is the answer. That is the answer, not a possibility, not the best possibility, just the answer. And then if they go on the next day and ask for a similar readout, is it going to be the same thing? How is AI in this case quantifying that uncertainty?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
no, I didn't mean to cut you off, Alex, but yeah, Ian, you resonated with me for sure, because that was something that stood out to me. The case that the guy in the podcast was making, the professor in the podcast was making, was that there's he was almost like idealistically thinking about the old original version of the search model, which gave you some options, which then you had to evaluate, and basically saying generative AI was giving an answer rather than options. So that does seem like a huge problem. Like if I can Google different climate models right now, and maybe there's not like, you know, a map that's going to show me my city over 50 years, but I've got a bunch of options from which I can extrapolate. That does require knowing a little bit about what modeling does and how to interpret potential error bars and uncertainty margins and things. On the other hand, just giving a straight up answer, while that doesn't require those sort of epistemic contexts, limits what you could know. So it's a lot more contingent on the algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those things make me nervous, right? I don't trust the general public to interpret error margins clearly. I think that's really dangerous, actually. There's a great book on that topic, actually. And I also don't trust generative AI systems to give me an answer that is precise or accurate, even.
So Jonathan, hold that thought about interpreting error margins because I want to return to it when we talk about education more explicitly later. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Just that you know, the podcaster could be optimistically looking to the future of a very sophisticated generative model being able to accomplish these tasks, but they're actually quite far from what you described, Dr. Beaver, by their very design. You know, we talked about consternation of faculty teaching with AI, and we've all tried different approaches. And one of the things that I do is ask my students to use generative AI and then vet the response and submit their own. And it's fascinating because we'll have simple requirements for an assignment, like write me a paragraph between 300 and 500 words, and it'll spit back 230 words. So you can define a very simple constraint, and the way it's designed, it will not meet that constraint. So it's a simple constraint, and probably it can be redesigned. But what we're asking is we want veracity in the information and the ability to set constraints, like tell me what the climate model is going to be like over in California. And the way they exist now, there's no guarantee it's going to give you the correct information, right? When it can't meet a simple constraint of the type I've described. And then more to the point, what is the imperative for those that roll out the generative AI and tools that will evolve in different variants of it to actually meet some specific constraints? Dr. Beaver's constraints are very important from the standpoint of ethics, of epistemology, of sustaining society, of sustaining democracy. We can keep running with that. Who decides and is ultimately the decision making going to be falling on the shoulders of the users to be aware that they were not the decider, that their constraint is not actually being sustained by the tool, and therefore we're still stuck in the old search model of we really need to vet everything that comes out of that beast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does so I think we're in agreement that there is more need of transparency generally in how these things work, which kind of, I guess, is at odds with the proprietary nature of these technologies and the incentive structures that are created for people to develop these. But I'm wondering, because I hear a lot about more specific kinds of AI that are used, for instance, to support people in doing specific tasks and jobs, that are, built on not just read all of Wikipedia and every, public domain article and just tell me what you think about that, but that are performing very specific functions and that can perform these specific functions in ways that are actually freeing us. I like this idea of, do we want to be educating people to compete with AI, even though we know that in the long run, they're probably not going to win that competition? Or do we want to educate them to use AI to, get rid of that, the drudgery in the work, right? The things that the AI can do and it can do better. And I'm not talking about ChatGPT specifically here. I'm talking about all different iterations that might be involved in performing different specific tasks. And I might be limiting here myself again to thinking about algorithms, but that would really enable us to rethink the nature of work and how we train people to do work. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. If there is any possibility in terms of that actually being beneficial, or if we'll be falling back into these same dangers that you outlined.
Yeah, I was thinking about that while listening to the podcast. Like one of the other things that stood out to me along the same lines is the professor was saying, imagine a classroom where, we can really, I think the term he used was really scale up, right? Where we can sort of say we can serve a lot more students personally by letting specific intelligence, like ASI modeling, take over some of the mundane tasks, like grading quizzes and responding to emails about scheduling and like all of the sort of things that eat up our time. And it sounded a little idealistic to me, but basically the idea was you'd have a bunch of assistants, and those AI assistants would be doing some of the mundane tasks. And as long as you didn't end up serving the assistants, then you could have like this little army of an infinite army of little assistants doing some of the mundane tasks for you, so that you could do whatever the subset of things that you think are important are. That was intriguing, but it also felt a little, like I said, idealistic. I can't imagine a world where that would be a functional way to work. And in and outside of education, you could also imagine the machinist, right? Who's like spending their time ordering materials and setting up machines and calibrating equipment before they actually get down to the work of turning apart. Maybe there's a world in which a series of AI assisted bots and robots and bots can do some of that work so that they can focus on the artistry of machining. But I'm suspicious.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stuck in a kind of a very naive, maybe theoretical sense, theoretical framework that if indeed an AI tool is sophisticated enough to help with grading, then the AI tools must exist that are sophisticated enough to generate such content to be graded, right? Because the grading and the analyzing and the thinking is a higher level function than generating that content. The whole point of grading is to train people to be able to do a task. If the AI tool is so sophisticated that we can assess it, then the tool must be sophisticated enough to generate that content. And so are we really going to need to teach that? Do we need people to learn how to do those things? Or are we fundamentally saying those jobs and those skills have gone anyway. There's things that we just don't do anymore. Like we don't write in cursive, right? There's some kinds of things that we learn to do in mathematics and are simply not taught anymore. I did learn at one point how to solve a quadratic equation by hand. It's not taught in schools anymore. If the AI tools are that sophisticated, we have to recognize that there are going to be economic incentives that drive them into the workplace and that are going to shift the nature of work. I don't think the nature of work is going to shift in a liberating sense. I think the nature of work is going to shift in a necessitating sense. Climate change is driving people from coal jobs into other jobs, right? Very, very disruptive and very challenging, even politically charged, that one issue. We don't need so many people in call centers anymore because the bots are good enough to actually do call center work. Those jobs are going. Already, we've had a lot of online legal services that are done, without the need for lawyers. There will be some differential diagnosis that can handle simple medical tasks, and in fact, are needed to serve rural communities. I think economic incentives, economic drivers are going to cause this kind of displacement. And it may not even be an issue of using AI to teach those things because we won't teach those things.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, one thing that I was thinking as I was listening, and also kind of when I was listening to what you were just saying, Steve, it seems to me that one kind of side effect of AI and the development of AI, it's, increasing proliferation in all sorts of industries, and now thinking about how it plays a role in education is, or in, professional fields that are directly related to the way we approach our education of future professionals, is how it, in many ways, shows us that the way we think about our education is, at best obsolete, at worst, maybe it was always very wrong-headed, right? Because philosophers, I guess, have been always romanticizing for a more meaningful kind of education, thinking about critical thinking, conversations. But, in practice, it's a lot more knowledge-driven, content-driven. And maybe it's kind of a bit of a rude awakening now that we are forced to realize that we've reached a point where, computers can do all that we assumed that humans needed to be able to do a lot better. And it's almost like an existential crisis in terms of where does that leave humans in terms of their role in the world. And I think it's easy, because it seems almost like an existential crisis, to fall back to thinking about all the negative aspects that kind of keeps us from reimagining what life and work within, future society could look like, right? Like, I'm sure it will be a function of necessity, and changing industries and all that. But I think there might be room, for reimagination that we could not get ourselves to do. We were always stuck in a very, unimaginative, like only recently have we realized how pedagogically unsound many of the methods which we have used historically to teach students at all levels and at all ages have been. And I think AI makes that even more stark, right? In terms of you don't even need to be doing that anymore, right? So a lot of teachers who only know how to do one thing, for instance, might find themselves now, puzzled in terms of, okay, the AI will take my job, and instead of thinking about what can I, as a teacher or educator or professor, do in a way that the AI cannot do, instead of thinking of that, they're just stuck in trying to preserve the old way of doing things. I'm generally, I have to disclose, I'm generally more pessimistic that I present myself now. I'm just trying to, open us to potentially good possibilities.
I appreciate the idealism. I mean, I think it jives with the um, proactive approach that we've taken with the technology, like try it out and see what happens kind of approach. I could see a world, Alex, right, in which like in our classrooms as educators, we've got support and training and education, all those things to know how to use AI technologies to build better personal relationships and build those critical dialogue moments with more students, because we're not having to do all these other tasks that can be taken over by the machine. But then the pessimism for me creeps back in, right? I could also imagine an alternative world where an institution says, oh, AI models can do all this extra stuff for you, so we're going to increase your course caps, and we're going to, you're going to serve 800 students rather than 400 students in a seminar. And I wondered, Ian, from your perspective, right? In your institution, are you seeing AI conversations among educators? Are you seeing use by students? Like, what does that look like coming from your field?
I appreciate you asking that. It's very different than what I feel like what I've seen at UCF. At Rollins, it seems that there is a lot of conversation about it, and it seems a little um, all over the place, for lack of a better word. So there is an emphasis on training people on like the basics of what, something like chat can do for you. And by like training faculty, like there's been a few faculty workshops. But then I've seen faculty say, well, if this is so inevitable, I'm just going to I'm going to put AI into my assignments so that students have to use it. And then that has created a whole slew of other issues, because what if a student uses the free version versus using a paid for subscription that's going to give out a better quality? And I'm sitting there kind of shaking my head, because at the end of the day, as an educator, I'm thinking, what is my learning objective? Is it to have them write an essay, or is it to have them have a tiny section in that essay that actually is meaningful? And if they want to fluff it with AI to produce the rest of the essay, that's fine. I'm just looking for that little bit of stuff they put in. And I can usually tell. I mean, at least I think I can. Who knows? So it's interesting. It seems like it's a little all over the place. That's one thing I liked about the podcast, was that it wasn't all doom and gloom, although admittedly I do think it was a little too idealistic. It's a tool, and for now it's a tool we can use as educators and students can use, but I don't know what that's going to look like a year from now or 5 years from now.
Alex, I wrote down a quote from that podcast. The interviewee had said, "Nobody wants description; they want stories or narrative." And I wondered if that resonated with you. Excuse me, one sec.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. Again, it kind of goes to, I think it goes to a lot of interesting questions about even what makes us human, especially when a lot of the things that we assume are part of being human are now being done by computers, and they're being done in many ways better than us. And I thought that was an interesting distinction in terms of writing. So Steve, just to give you some context, the professor was talking about changing the way we teach writing, and essentially critiquing the formulaic, 5-paragraph essay with topic sentences that do exactly this, and which are very artificial, and no professional writer ever writes like that in the real world, right? Or not professional writer even, but even people who are assumed to be really good writers don't write like that, right? You read a novel, you read a paper, you read an op-ed, it seems like there's an experience that the author is trying to take you to create, and take you through a narrative that does more than just describe a situation, right? And this can be more evocative, even if it's just an argument. There's so many dimensions to what a human being does when they write and they try to communicate something rather than just communicate facts, right? And I thought that that is in many ways a meaningful distinction, because as good as AI is, there is just such an intuitive sense in which writing, you understand whether writing is good or bad, right? Or at least to your taste, because people have different tastes, I guess, when it comes to writing. And that, for me at least, my experience writing, it's very unconscious. I can never really put my finger into what it is that makes some writing better than others, because it doesn't necessarily come to the level of words, right? One author can use the same exact words as another. They don't have to be very fluffy or literary or something like that to really evoke something as you're reading. So if it's not really easy to put your finger on what makes a good narrative and storytelling, such that it will really touch the reader, I think that there is something substantive in terms of the difference between human writing, which is, assuming good human writing, and the very formulaic descriptive writing that we assume that humans need to learn. And maybe they do need to learn it in order to surpass it and go to the more, you know, creative aspect of the writing. But maybe us just hammering down, on students, learn this 5-paragraph, right, essay, is not the best approach to teach creative writing or the joys of writing. And in many ways, I think it sometimes alienates students. I still remember as a kid when I had to learn that version, that we also had a 5-paragraph essay in Greece. And it also had the same, these are the ideas you need to talk about. This is how you will talk about them on each paragraph. I really disliked writing so much that I went toward a STEM direction, and then circuitously came back to become, a philosopher writing 20-page essays and very lengthy manuscripts. So that gives you a sense of how, in some ways, this formulaic writing can be off-putting to students, because it misses what students can add that is truly them, and that really motivates someone as a writer to become better and truly learning how to communicate these things that are perhaps not easy to communicate without writing. So I was very positive, I guess, to that distinction between the descriptive writing. And I don't think I would be, very sad if descriptive writing stopped being a human affair, right? In many ways, it seems that AI, maybe not ChatGPT with the hallucinations and all that going on, but in many ways, it seems that AI can be a much better descriptive writer than many humans are. Which is only natural, right? Because it has a grasp of a lot more information that humans can have, and can potentially present more balanced versions of what is out there. But we cannot rely on AI to interpret and provide us good reasons for why to believe something, or for why something is the way it is.
Well, this is going to sound silly, but one of my favorite uses of generative AI so far has been the aggregation of Amazon reviews. This was an implementation that's not particularly old, but it's so interesting because, Amazon reviews are all over the map, and some of them are spam, and some of them are just off the wall complaining, and some of them are like random 5 stars. But generative AI has been used to aggregate sometimes thousands of reviews into a single couple of sentences that say most purchasers think X and Y. And that's been really interesting to see, because aggregating that much information is the point, I think, of generative AI. So yeah, sorry, sidebar.
On that example, to put a sidebar on your sidebar, it's also known that a lot of comments are actually bot generated and computer generated. So now we have the computer analyzing the computer's output. back to descriptive writing, very little writing is, what color is the ball? It usually has some more purpose, some other purpose. And even scientific writing, it can be engaging in the way it's done. It can be, it has a point to drive home, whether you use a 5-paragraph or 4-paragraph format. Even a paragraph itself can have different structures. So I think you're right when you say you teach a structure, you learn some structures, you see some examples, and then you're positioned to move into a creative space because you learn the tools. In the same way that lots of kids want to go out and play soccer, and sometimes they get frustrated and they quit soccer because you got to do the drills. Okay, well, maybe we should reteach the way we teach kids soccer, and they can run around the field like a mob and kick the ball like crazy, but they may not become very good soccer players. Sometimes there's some sweat equity that you have to put into any endeavor to really reach a level of expertise, right? And which pedagogic tools or processes we take to get there is to be debated. Some may be better than others, but often it just takes some work. And we want to look and see where using any kind of AI tool is short-circuiting the work versus short-circuiting the drudgery. To your point, and now I put a question, when we talk about descriptive writing and turning that over to AI, where does journalism fall, Alex, in your mind? Should we turn over journalism to generative AI? Some may think of it as descriptive, some may think of it as involving analysis. And I'm not talking about opinion pieces, which are clearly analytical. I'm talking about, here's what happened today in Gaza. Some people just want the facts. Okay, so maybe that's great for generative AI. Some people really want to understand the context. Why is this particular bombing of this particular hospital significant? Well, maybe understanding how many times it's happened, or who was injured, or what precedent it sets, or why it's particularly catastrophic. Maybe that's analysis. I don't know. So journalism, what do you think? Generative AI, yes or no?
Yeah, I think you exactly how you described it, Steve, right? I think that there is, if people read, articles of journalism, investigative journalism, whatever that may be, not op-eds included, of course, and they assume that they're an objective, list of facts, then either that would be really bad journalism, or they would just assume an objectivity that is not necessarily fully there, right? And I think the same can be said of many things, right? History is an interesting field as well, because there's so many different ways in which a particular time period can be interpreted, and through lines that can be drawn, and the contextual factors, right? So, and that's why you have so many different interpretations. And as long as they're grounded in the facts and they have follow consistent historical methods, we accept them as good historical accounts. The problems start, of course, when they start dropping, picking and choosing, cherry picking data, right? The same way that, hey, Josh, the same way that any scientist could cherry pick data to make a point, that's just not an objective presentation of the facts. But even if you do have the facts down, you cannot really make a compelling representation of something, even if it's more on the descriptive side, I guess, than the storytelling side, without having that kind of human critical analysis that is involved. And I don't think neither in journalism nor in history nor most other skilled forms of writing that you can have that. I think that ChatGPT, for instance, or generative AI of all sorts would be good in terms of presenting you like brute facts, right? Now, how these kind of go together involves a degree of interpretation that maybe the AI is in a position to do, but perhaps if the AI does it, it's kind of hidden within, the way in which the analysis happens, and then that kind of brings out problems of the sort that we were describing before with Google, right? Why does it choose to present this side of something versus another, and that type of thing? And there you need more transparency in order to understand, right? Because it's easy to Google an author and see their political affiliation or, their background, their experiences, where they're coming from, and take that into consideration. But you can't really do that with AI. So yeah, that was a very circuitous, not very to the point response, but I guess, that's a general way of thinking about that.
So with that quote, the narrative versus the description and everything we've talked about, it did resonate with me. It brought up some recurring themes between last semester and this talk already, is that quote unquote obvious distinction between what the limit that the generative AI can do to approach humanity, for example, in terms of writing or thought, and what humans can do. And like we just said, obviously we're discounting op-eds in this example, but maybe we're having this conversation in a few months and it's not so obvious. Maybe that line is getting approached, or it's getting blurred at least. Because surely ChatGPT, if you tell it, hey, generate 20 different op-eds right now about this topic, it will, and some of them will be leaning one way, some of them the other, some of them in neutral. I think, I hope that there is always going to be that human element, but I think that line will eventually get blurred in writing. So that narrative versus descriptive, I think it's going to be, I don't think it's going to matter at some point.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ian. And that what you said also made me think about, the possibility that you tell the AI, write an op-ed on this topic like X journalist would write it, and it will just pick all these characteristics that it associates with that person and try to give it a voice that presumably is somewhat, there's a bent toward one belief or another, or things of that sort. And if it can do that, then who's to say that it cannot start developing, I guess, more complex representations? But then I find myself wondering, where would the AI? I assume there is some bias embedded within every technology, right? Because there's humans who create it. And then I wonder to what extent this bias would start becoming, part of this less descriptive, more storytelling writing of the AI, or if indeed AI could become very objective, where it would just draw the line to, it cannot write something without actually having to take a particular position, or be more favorable to one interpretation over another. Whether AI would ever have conflicts, I guess, of this sort.
So here's where I get really excited about the technology, because in some ways what we're talking about is the same. You can make an equivalency to sort of child development. So early ChatGPT models, so 2 and 3, had pretty limited short-term memory. They couldn't be trained and sustained, so they did a thing and then their cache was cleared, basically, to extend a maybe naive metaphor. But ChatGPT-4 has a order of magnitude better memory function and higher capacity for taking things on. So it can basically build personality traits or modes of interacting with users that can be sustained over time. So there is a sense in which we're moving towards like personalities, AI models that are all run on the same back end, that because of their interactions are trained to move in particular ways. And I think in some ways that's what happens when we're raising young persons too, is that we sort of train them in the mode of how to be empathetic with other people, even if that's, to set aside whether that's real or modeled, but empathetic with other people, or good philosophers, or, good rhetoricians, or whatever it might be. And what kind of technical knowledge we train them on, but also how we interact with them shapes what they're going to be. And that's where I get excited, because I think we're looking at a future where there are lots of different artificial persons floating around out there with whom you can have interactions. And so you can find one that jives with your way of interacting. And no different than it is making friends, you'd make friends with systems on whom you can rely to react in particular ways. And sure, those could be destroyed, but that's what gets me excited. Like, it's not that there's going to be iRobots running around, but you'll have your choice of how to interact with these systems. And that is, I don't know if that helps with the conversation, but that's the thing that gets me excited.
Well, it gets me concerned, Dr. Beaver. Time to push back. Is that a healthy thing? I mean, what parallel could you draw between the enthusiasm you described and the current situation that we have with echo chambers in social media? And how do we gain exposure to new thoughts? And how imperative is that for the enrichment and growth of the human self, the exposure to others? We preach, I believe, in diversity. What you talked about is a very monoclonal existence. So I'm gonna play with that one. What do you, I mean, I kind of like the idea. No, wait, I don't know if I like myself enough to want to talk to myself. I'm doing that now. Well, anyway, back to you.
No, I hear you. We can write a little science fiction story on the fly right now. You could imagine, a parent really wants their child to be raised in a ultra conservative, nationalist, fundamentalist tradition. And so they spend 5 years carefully training an AI ChatGPT-4 version that runs on their own server, on a really particular and really narrow set of inputs, but also to provide really particular kinds of responses. And then they introduce that AI model like an Alexa to their 5-year-old and say, here's your nanny. And for the next 5 years, their child's being raised by a intentionally designed, manipulative artificial system. What does that do to the child then when it enters the world, so to speak, right? Yeah, that's a totally dystopian science fiction piece that we should write
I
collectively.
think Asimov did a short story, but I can't think of the name, where there's a robot with a positronic brain that is the playmate for a child growing up. I think Asimov wrote that story. Sure.
Would not be surprised. Josh, go ahead.
That's something I think. So that description, that sort of AI nanny is not one that's attracted me. But I wonder if, like, I imagine, parents sometimes they're frustrated and they react with anger when they want to react with care, all those things. You can imagine a very good version of this AI that, like, always is giving love when the child needs it, is responding, in ways that recognize their feelings without, invalidating, all that sort of thing. And I think that there still might be something that's worrisome there, which is like, okay, is there something? Integrity, I think, is the word we sometimes say, like unreal or wrong about it coming from this like manufactured place. But I think we're always socializing our children, or we're socializing each other too, but we're always socializing in certain ways. And so I don't know if merely making the choice to do it intentionally is such a problem, even if it's ratcheted up. So I have this, like, I'm holding to my guns over here that we're always making choices. And so even if I'm socializing to make my kid egalitarian and kind, blah, 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 that might not be a problem. But I do still have that feeling. I think many of us have this gut that, like, something seems to be going wrong there. It's not, I don't know, real in my way.